Thanks for joining me here on ClariT Media. This is Alicia. Glad to be with you tonight. I hope you enjoy these episodes of the Bay Area Mental Health Hour and ClariT Conversations. Now, if you're interested in advertising your business, products, or services, reach out to me at aliciamayo430@gmail.com or call me at 707-430-8355. I will be more than happy to talk with you about your goals for your business, your marketing and social media plans, etc. I do it all. That's what I'm here for. I'm a nonprofit 501c3. That means my rates are affordable if you're interested. So again, thank you for joining me here on ClariT Media for ClariT Conversations and the Bay Area Mental Health Hour. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube. Look for the Bay Area Mental Health Hour or ClariT Media. Thank you. Firefighters are first responders to unimaginable life and death emergencies. They train to save lives, but coping with the weight of the noble task of being a firefighter can lead to an internal fire of depression, anxiety, and sometimes suicide. Who will answer the call for the firefighter as they try to find ways to cope with post-traumatic stress injury?
Or post-traumatic stress injury is no different than breaking your leg. With the proper treatment and follow through, you can heal. You don't have to turn to a life of self-medication, whether it's alcohol or drugs. And we're getting to a place now rapidly, that we're putting our members in a place where they can seek help and not worry about, I'm going to get a fitness for duty. My colleagues are going to think I'm weak. They're going to think I'm crazy. They're not going to trust me. They're going to think I'm on drugs. There's so much to it.
Well, can you then explain, for clarification purposes, the portion of the um, Senate Bill 542, the rebuttable portion of it for the presumption of post-traumatic stress injury?
Senate Bill 542, our author and partner is Senator Henry Stern. Senator Stern was affected by the Woolsey fire. There was a lot of things that kind of, I think, played into this, but Senator Stern really took this effort to heart. And there's two things, there's several things going on with it. And you mentioned explaining the rebuttable portion of it. When I started on the job, you had to prove that this came from work. And a rebuttable presumptive means it is presumed that through the course and scope of your employment and all the things that you did, you contracted this on the job, and it puts the burden on the employer to prove that you did not. It is no walk in the park. It's diagnosable and it's treatable. So, one of the things, and I talked to Henry about this at length, this is critically important as we talk to legislators. This is not about seeking a disability or retirement. This is about getting help to protect the investment that a municipality has in their firefighter. You take let's just say a 15-year veteran. Over that course of time, the department, whether it's a city, county, or special district, probably has close to $2 million invested in that employee through training, through licensing, through certification, their experience, you don't want to just throw that away. You want to protect that. And so we're trying to um, change the whole thought process here. Protect your investment, and your investment is it's your people. And so it puts the employee in a position that they can seek help and not have a fear of retaliation or going down a road that, first thing we need to do is have a mental health fitness for duty test. We need to see if you're mentally fit to even do this. It takes that out of the equation and really puts the member in a spot where they can seek help for whatever it is that's got them there.
In confidentiality.
In confidentiality, and it's treated by physicians. When I started in the fire service, and I think I said this, it was, you can't get a stress retirement. That's what we called it, stress. And every firefighter that watches this will probably agree with me. Through the course of our careers, we've had periods where we couldn't eat, we couldn't concentrate, we had trouble sleeping, we were irritable with our family, all because of things that we did and experienced on the job. We didn't know what it was. Now, all those things I mentioned to you, now I know what they are. I know when I go to that call, what I can expect from it and how I can begin to process it, not just in, but process it out. And that kind of comes into AB 1116, the peer support bill and confidentiality. Right now, we're kind of living in a little bit of a utopia. Labor and management both get it, that we're doing this right and we're being confidential, but it just takes one bad day. It doesn't matter, one bad move on labor side, one bad move on management side. And if a peer supporter gets called into a fact finding, all of a sudden that trust is gone. The other side of it, I guess I would say the opponents, and we heard this, and actually spoke to Governor Brown as part of the discussion on the veto, was, there's a fear that you're trying to hide facts in an administrative hearing on a discipline or this or that. And it's like, number one, we can't hide facts. We're mandatory reporters by law. There are certain things that we must report. This is about one more element of peer-to-peer trained peer-to-peer support, so that the peer supporter can evaluate and recommend that member to a higher level of help. And that higher level of help could be a full-blown clinician. It could be a website with different tools on it to begin to demystify some of the things that you're going through. But I feel very strongly on this bill, the confidentiality piece is a key to it. We're not trying to hide anything from anybody. What we're trying to do is protect California's investment in their firefighters and protect their mental health by making sure they get treatment.
Yeah, the long-term studies talk about the fact that firefighters don't even make it to retirement, where they can give back after ongoing treatment, if that's what they need, whatever the treatment, uh, uh, whatever form that treatment comes in, it will benefit the firefighter in the long term, who can reach retirement before suicide to
I mean, I
contribute.
can, and I won't name names because people are still known in the community. But I think of one, and I will use his first name, Frank, a salt of the earth, a great firefighter. First guy that ever taught me to like a black walnut milkshake. If you never had one, they're delicious. But Frank had a stellar career. I went on the call with him in his van and a deer rifle under his chin, most of his head gone, on top of the ceiling of the car, the rifle under his chin, and having to get in there because we knew the car, but is this who we think it is? And having to do an initial identification with it. I'm just one firefighter. You can go across this state and find other guys and gals just like me that have had to do the same thing. down to the very day, um, I believe it was the last Senate committee hearing, I sat right next to Senator Henry Stern, and one of our members gave testimony, Captain Derek Robinson out of Kern County, and then I gave testimony, and I led off with this, and I forget the date. It was about mid-July, but I told the legislators, I go, in the last 3 weeks, 3 California firefighters have died by their own hand in the last 3 weeks, and it hits home. It doesn't hit everybody, but when it does, and if it's the, in their mind, the ultimate cure, what do you even say to that? I shouldn't. I shouldn't even. A normal person should not know 7 people that killed themselves, and you certainly shouldn't have worked with them. And we're so far behind the 8 ball, um, in not just our recognition, but aggressively seeking legislation and help for our members. And it, I was at a line of duty service last week, a Cal Fire young man that was lost in the line of duty, and I actually sent my boys a text and said, "I am very grateful that you did not pursue a career in the fire service, because I saw a piece of my profession today that I didn't like, and what that was a father my age trying to come to grips with losing his 28-year-old boy, and I wanted to go over to the Capitol and really go, why the hell are we fighting for this? This stuff is a no-brainer. The community and the state is invested in these men and women's training. We are not taking care of them. And the fact that, we're fighting tooth and nail for these protections, it's to me, it's mind-boggling.
And so the crisis referral portion will make it possible for the firefighter who is in a crisis, who seeks help, to do what? What will those steps look like? What would you like for them to look like?
So what you would see today, if we have a peer support program going, and a firefighter seeks help from a peer, the peer is going to talk that firefighter through what they're going through and be able to identify where to plug him in or her in to the next line of resources. In the perfect world, um, some of these things can be mitigated down peer to peer if it's caught early enough. But a person in crisis, you're not mitigating that down. But for us to have vetted clinicians that work with firefighters and know what we do for a living, it's a resource that is priceless. Here in Sacramento, through our behavioral health labor management group, the last count I had, we had 26 vetted clinicians that deal strictly with firefighters and that we have. And getting that person to help, and then getting them the benefits to continue that care, to get them healed, to get them back to work. Because that's the one weird thing about firefighters, men and women. If they're injured, the first thing they'll say to you is, "When can I go back to work?" It's in 30 years, it's the craziest thing I've ever heard. The men and women in this job are very, very committed. And the very worst case scenario is we get them to a rehabilitation center. Our international union has recognized how important this is, that they have built what is called the Center for Excellence in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, and it deals with PTSI, alcohol, and drug use, and they in partnership with Advanced Recovery Systems, and it is only for firefighters. And part of our battle now is getting that program recognized by insurance companies and getting it recognized in the workers' comp arena. It has been successful enough that the international currently is looking at property for a site here in California, in Southern California. And, in my home local, we've sent a couple of people there, and you don't have to go far to know firefighters that have been to the center of excellence. And to have that resource on the West Coast is going to be huge. You know, it cuts out a lot of travel, but you're going into a facility with people that know your issues. They know your culture as a firefighter. They know the least common denominators of what we do and what we seek to find relief, and to be among your peers in a recovery setting with professionals that know what you do and focus on you. It's going to get our members healed, back to their families, and back to work, you know, quicker.
And will they cover firefighters who are retired, who still?
This would cover any firefighter. And
Okay.
it's interesting and sad that you mentioned this. One of the early meetings we had with our retired firefighters to talk about behavioral health, and that there's help available. When Mike got done speaking, what they said, and they weren't being funny, they said, "Why do you think we drink?" You know, and I believe I left the line as an active fire company officer 11 years ago. And in my observation, and I think this holds true in every community in California, this job is twice as busy and twice as violent today as it was when I left the line. And it's not getting any better. And some of the things that cause these reactions in people, it's not all at once, it's a buildup. It's like putting a rock in a backpack. Pretty soon it gets so heavy that it drags you down and you can't carry it anymore. It's not always these big, huge, awful events. They're part of it, but it's the everyday thing that we do on the job. And I could give you instances of things that I've done, you know, but they're things that I remember. The ones that I don't remember are the ones that concern me, and they don't always come out. And we're all the same that way. I'm not telling you. The only thing that's unique about what I may tell you is I'm telling you. I just want people to know that I care. This is a profession that blessed me, and it blessed my family. It gave me a way to give back to my community. And I think, I guess for me, this is protecting the men and women that protect us. That's why I'm doing this.
If you are in a crisis, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255 or call Safe Call Now, a 24-hour responder helpline at 1-206-459-3020. Black woman owned. ClariT Media. Firefighters are first responders to unimaginable life and death emergencies. They train to save lives, but coping with the weight of the noble task of being a firefighter can lead to an internal fire of depression, anxiety, and sometimes suicide. Who will answer the call for the firefighter as they try to find ways to cope with post traumatic stress injury?
So I wanted to start today's conversation off with just the concept of resiliency and just the fact that we as human beings, we are resilient in both the physical sense, but also in the mental health sense. We can go through many difficult times and figure out our way around it. It doesn't necessarily have to turn out to be a big thing where we need, additional help and resources. But there also are times in which we do need additional resources and we need to get attention for various conditions. So with our discussion today being about first responders and mental health, I'm curious if you guys can share maybe a few experiences that you've had and how maybe the role could have led to maybe you needed more additional resources or the actual sense that you took care of it on your own. What experiences have you guys had, both personally as well as occupationally?
Well, I think for me, in our organization, the Ghost Ship warehouse fire was kind of a big moment that shed a spotlight on this sort of thing. And it was one of the first times in my 30 years that our administration realized that the behavioral health of firefighters and the mental health was kind of a big deal. That's not to say there weren't resources in place before that,
Certainly.
but it was kind of a hit and miss sort of thing, and it didn't really work out too well. There wasn't a lot of buy-in from the membership. I like one of the things you said in your introduction about, there are these singular moments, but typically, I would imagine that Sean and Drew would agree with me that it's the cumulative effect, it's the long-term thing. So even though for our organization, the Ghost Ship was a big deal and was kind of a point of a rallying point or something, for lack of a better way to phrase it, it's the cumulative effects over the career. And I think it's been great to see a culture change in our organization where now we're willing to discuss and talk about the fact that, we are we do need to work on resiliency and understand that and find healthy ways to deal with the issues that come up rather than the destructive and unhealthy ways that I know I've personally had happen over the course of my career. And we're trying to make it a much better response to these things.
You talked about the Ghost Ship fire, and of course, most people have some knowledge of that incident. We can certainly qualify that as a crisis, both for the community as well as for the first responders who were involved. What do you think, just from your experience, personal experience, as well as just kind of broader experience, what would lead individuals who participated as first responders to have experienced something significant in that event to where maybe they needed some additional help or additional resources? What exactly was about? What happened in that event that made it to where you needed something additional?
Well, part of it is, as firefighters, we always like to know and think that we did the best that we could do, and life safety is an important part of our job. And despite our best efforts that night, 36 people lost their lives. So that can weigh on you and weigh on your head and get in your brain in and of itself. Then there was the extensive body recovery efforts, and then there's the media, everything you see on TV, even when you're trying not to think about it or you're not at work, it's in the TVs, it's in the newspapers, and it's even come back with the trial and that sort of thing that's going on. So that's in your head, and those are things that'll never leave. And at the time, our organization, our department was very young. We had many firefighters with a year or less or 2 years less on the job. That night, one of the members of my crew was a probationary firefighter that had 6 months on the job. So it was one of the first really good fires they'd been to, much less one, and we have a large loss of life like that becomes a national incident. It's a lot to have to carry and to talk about. And I think the challenge for me that night as a lieutenant and the days immediately after was to make sure I checked in with the people that work under me and make sure that they understand and acknowledge that this is a big deal and it's going to affect us, and let's take care of ourselves and keep checking in and acknowledge that, so we don't, it doesn't manifest itself into something destructive that we would bring home to our families or our personal lives or that sort of thing.
Certainly. You talked about the cumulative effect of, I'm assuming, different calls and different experiences that you have as a firefighter. I'm curious if the other panel members may chime in on that as well. Just the simple fact that you are expected to go to certain calls, handle your job, and then move on to the next. And my assumption is that there are certain calls that stick with you. And maybe there was an individual who was a younger person or an older person for that matter. But I'm curious if you guys can kind of give your insight in terms of the point about the cumulative effect that may take place in your line of business.
Well, for myself, I started fire service at age 22 in 1993. So I was young. I didn't really understand what I was entering. I thought I was entering a profession that would allow me to go help people, and that's all I knew. I didn't understand that by doing so, I deposited a little bit of every incident into me. When you talk about resiliency, I guess what I have going on for me early on was that I love to work out. So I played a lot of basketball, go to the gym. I had positive things that helped me release, some of the tension. As I got older, and it wasn't as easy to play basketball or to recover, I started noticing that it was a little bit more difficult to sometimes process things at night. So I was fortunate enough to fulfill a promise to my stepfather as he was dying. He passed in 2008 while I was preparing for the tennis test. And that was to go back and get my bachelor's degree. And at USF, I learned more than just about business. I learned about the Jesuits' way of self-reflection and going back. It was under the self-reflection exercises in school that I understood that there was more happening to me from the impact of my job than I ever had imagined. And I learned certain triggers, and I learned how to address it and to adapt. And I looked around the fire service to other people and started realizing that a lot of people in fire service were having the same experiences. They didn't have positive ways of actually releasing it. They went to more negative ways. There was industry, sort of acceptable to get off of work and go straight to the bar to deal with your problems versus maybe get off of work and go to the gym or go for a walk, or a ride or whatever. So I think it was my time at USF that made me realize how to first identify my stressors, then how to better cope with them. And then I wanted to take those experiences that I learned and bring it back to the industry to help my brothers and sisters who I knew were experiencing the same thing, but in many ways did not know it was happening to them.
Certainly. You brought up a lot of good points. I think the piece that I pull from what you talked about is really just the idea of self-care, right? And so we all have things that we do to help with the stress that we endure on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes those things we do are positive self-care concepts, and some of the things we do are not so positive, and they can be kind of a short-term sort of solution, with the obvious one being just kind of alcohol and other substances that might take you away from your reality. But you raised some really good points just around figuring out really what it is that works for you, right? Some people are really into specific hobbies, whether it's softball or baseball. Some people like to be a part of a larger organization and do some volunteer work. There's clearly countless different ways in which we involve ourselves in self-care. But the fact of the matter is that if you don't figure out a way to manage the stressors that you endure on a high impact sort of job, it's going to affect you sooner or later, right? And also above and beyond that, it can also manifest itself in different areas of your life. So if you're married, you may find out that you're having, frequent and severe arguments with your spouse or your children. It's just different ways in which it manifests itself. So that concept is really important. And I'm glad to hear that you are in a position where you can share that with other people as well. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'd love to touch on the self-care aspect as well, Dr. L. Yeah, when I started in the fire service, I started as a lot of people do on the ambulance. So I was 18 years old and then first started out working for American Medical Response. I first started out working for American Medical Response at 18. And at that time, I was a second generation firefighter once I was hired in the fire service. So I started right along on the fire engine when I was 15 years old and saw things that no 15-year-old that I knew growing up endured unless it actually happened to them.
Sure.
So seeing dead children, Sid's baby at 16, seeing these sort of things at such a young age where you're vulnerable, you're still developing, and then even at 18 years old working on the ambulance and seeing a lot of trauma in the inner cities where I work, my self-care was crap. I mean, it was terrible. I didn't have the tools at that age. I was brought in under the generation that's no longer in the fire service, where the self-care was a lot of alcohol. The self-care was a lot of numbing. The self-care was hooking up with women and being proud of that. The self-care was a lot of marriages that I saw as a young age, just divorce and more trauma, the cycle, the broken cycle. So for me, I always had in the back of my mind that I didn't want to repeat the cycle, but I didn't know how to get out of it until my life changed when I was injured at 23, my hip being crushed, and then finally towards my 30th birthday, being medically retired from the fire service. At that time, I say you go from hero to zero. So I didn't have tools, and unfortunately, one of the tools I had was a gun at the time. And like a lot of first responders we see that are ending their lives, I thought about taking my own life at that time. I turned to yoga, and as a big guy, I was the only guy in a yoga class. So I was humbled, and here I was in chronic nerve pain. I also had a hidden challenge with post-traumatic stress at the time, and this was 2010, where the fire service wasn't talking about this.
Certainly.
We're just talking about it in this group now. We're just trying to get legislation now. So, the hush hush of this and that, and the fear of if this gets out, then what happens? My career, not being with workers' comp, right? A lot of fear when you're trying to get help and go through the process of, if I do say something, the investigation that goes into your psychology is traumatizing when you're trying to get help. So I sought out a lot of resources that were really non-traditional, as well as spirituality. I read every religious text out there to understand, human suffering has been since the dawn of creation. But why was it so much? How come I had this heavy thing and these intrusive thoughts of wanting to end my life when, my support system was also gone as a firefighter. So once I left the fire service, trying to share these things with the public in an executive role, good luck. Sure. Well, that's too much, So where could I go? Where could that trauma have a voice? As I exited the fire service and entered into corporate, that was also challenging. So now I have a ton of self-care tools, from yoga to meditation, twice a day, to reading, to journaling, to reframing my thoughts. If I start seeing a thought going on a negative, where a lot of, between 60 to 80% of human thought is negative, of immediately recognizing that and going, no, I'm not going to accept this as my truth. Let me reframe, restructure that. And then down, I'll admit it, it's in the bubble bath. I love that. Just sit there with some calm music, some candles, and things that I would have never done years ago.
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing that piece that's so personal to you. I think the idea of a stressor or the cumulative effects of stress or job and so forth, injuries, it can become so severe to the point where we don't really know what to do, right? And so even just you talking about it and disclosing that you had considered taking your own life within fire and police, that's not really talked about very much, right? Like the whole idea of you potentially appearing to be weak, not being able to do the job, people kind of not sure if they can trust you to assist on a call and so forth. It's very important for us to understand that how you felt is not an uncommon thing. Of course, we know the statistics about police officers even more so in terms of having a tough time dealing with the stressors of the job. But I admire you for sharing that piece of the story with us. Also, I'm glad to hear that you were able to locate and find some self-care techniques that actually did work out for you as well.
Thank you.
Please.
I think one of the things that, to piggyback on what you were saying, you mentioned it's important, I think, for us to talk about it and to pull it out of the shadows and to acknowledge it. And I feel as one of the older guys, I'm the number one seniority guy in the Oakland Fire Department right now. It's important for me when I'm sitting at the kitchen table at the firehouse after something to be able to say to the rest of the crew there, especially the guys with 1 or 2 years on, or the women with 1 or 2 years on, that was a really traumatic thing we just saw and we just went on. And it's messing with my head. It's really messing with me. And I need to talk about it right now with you guys so you know how it's messing with me. And I need to tell you the steps I'm going to take to try to alleviate those problems so I don't do it in a negative and a destructive way. And then that allows me to segue into Sean talked about self-reflection and what he learned at UCSF. And I think it's really important as well. Earlier in my career, when I was dealing with this stuff, this cumulative effect in a negative way, I failed a positive drug test and I went into a rehab program. And the most important thing I pulled out of that rehab program, I know now, is the ability to have some honest self-reflection. And so that I can sit there now at the kitchen table with my crew and when I talk to other firefighters and say, yeah, this was real negative. These things add up. This is how I dealt with it in a negative way. And it almost lost my career because of that. And the destructive things with family, the things you mentioned as well. But now I'm trying to do better and I've moved on, but we need to talk about this. We need to acknowledge that. And I understand and I'm here and I've been through it and now I'm on the far end of my career and I made it through and you can make it through too.
Sure. Even as mental health specialists, psychologists, when we have a group or if we have a case that we're working on and you walk away from it and that was just a really tough session, we do that exact same thing. We debrief with our colleagues. Sometimes we have to get on the phone and say, you know what, I need a couple moments of your time. And so I'm glad to hear that you're normalizing it within the field that you're in, but I just think that it just shows our human side, right? Anytime we go through something that's traumatic or something that's abnormal or something that may have an effect on us personally, it's okay for us to be affected by that. It's okay for us to be human. And I think it is a good idea and a good strategy, and it's very prudent for us to debrief in some form or fashion. It doesn't have to be this over formalized thing, but even if it's just a matter of verbally stating that was a really traumatic thing that we went through, that normalizes it for everyone else, and they don't have to feel as if they're the only one feeling what they're feeling and they can't talk about it. So I'm glad you shared.
And that's a huge cultural shift, I think, in the fire service, at least in my world of the fire service, from what it was when I was new. It was like, yeah, well, get over it, kid. That's the job, and if you can't take that part of the job, then maybe this isn't the line of work for you. So that culture teaches you or taught at a very early point in your career. You don't need, don't verbalize that. Don't say it. Yeah, this is bothering you, too bad. Deal with it and find another outlet. And all too often that other outlet tended to be a destructive way.
Certainly.
Yeah, and to add on though, is actually very important because again, I came in at 22, I was the second youngest in my class, but 25 years into my career, only a third of my class is still working. 2 or 3 are deceased, one from suicide, one from breast cancer, no one from organ failure. We have people leave, mental breakdown basically. And he comes back, talks about the importance. Now he was afraid to talk about what he was going through. And he went through it all by himself and then losing his job because he didn't have the support system. Have others, who retired going back and forth. But so it's important not only to have the resources available on paper, but to have, like I said, the emotional intelligence to recognize that when your brothers or sisters are having a change in pattern, having the courage to go talk to them, to bring them, even in their denial, the resources that they need. And like in Dan's case, you don't want to have to go to that point. And he was fortunate to be able to keep the job and have a story to share. And then having evolution in cultural change, where before I came into it was like, this is how you just deal with it. Just be quiet, go. You didn't cause it, just fix it and go back. To be able to say to your younger crew members, listen, bad things are going to happen. You need to be able to deal with them. If you want to have a healthy life, both for yourself and your family, these are some of the things you need to go. And so I think what a lot of us here right now want to be able to do is to bring that to people and say, this is a healthier way of it going. Take away this, the stigma against mental health as being a negative thing, but making a positive thing, like I mentioned before, just like exercise was not always the thing people did, or diet, but it took a lot of change to go there. So it's going to be a while, but I think it's very important to have people like yourself, Dr. Outlaw, who are bringing it out there, who are challenging us to talk about it.
Certainly.
And so, I really appreciate these opportunities just to be able to reflect and then to bring it to someone else.
Sure.
One thing too that Dan brought up too, I want to talk about is the concept now of post-traumatic growth, which is a new concept. And Sean, was mentioning emotional intelligence and your perspective too, what you see with patients that, go through trauma. I know the person that I was compared to the person that I am today. I'm very proud of the man that I am today. Who I was entering the fire service, I was still a good person overall, but until I went through a program, which was a 1 week long program for veterans and first responders to address, really the root cause of the trauma and different things. I was like running through life on autopilot, that subconscious mind, just, in full control, not really being conscious and awake and owning my piece of things too, as a man of, I am responsible for me. I am responsible for these decisions and whatnot. So Dan, how do you feel? Because it was challenging, like when I first started speaking on advocacy pieces of like, do I want to share that I went through a program, because like I still have a whole road in my 30s as a business leader that this stuff's taboo still. So I made that decision of like, no, people do need to hear it from us as leaders, because if they don't, then they're in limbo. But if they see us in leadership roles, there's a chance at them going forward. But how would you say the person you were then to who you are now after going through and getting help?
Oh, there's no comparison, and it was difficult. It was challenging, and it's a long road. But like you said, I'm happy I'm here, and I wouldn't change it now that I'm on the other side, because all of that makes it what it is. And it makes me, or it allows me the opportunity to not hold back in those situations. Whereas before I may have held back, and I'm on the tail end, and I'm just a grumpy old broken down firefighter who's looking to come out on the other side at least as well as I went in. And I think I'm better than when I went in, because I've learned and I've got all these tools to help make things better. And I hope that I can kind of get the culture changed, like Sean talked about, that we can acknowledge it and move on, and not move on, acknowledge it and deal with it in healthier ways. It's like turning a big cargo ship sometimes. It's really hard to get the direction to change, but you got to start a little bit at a time and start moving it in the right direction. And I know in our organization, and it seems like industry-wide, the last 3 or 4 years have seen a positive change in this direction to actually acknowledge and deal with firefighter and first responder behavioral and mental health issues. And it's not a rarity, and things are moving in the right direction.
Good. I have a question. This is kind of piggybacking off of a point that was previously made. So I initially talked about just human beings being resilient enough to take on stressors and traumas and still walk away from that and exist in life without needing much change. I'm assuming that there must be like a fine line between being able to deal with stuff and ultimately kind of like the old school way of kind of, all right, we kind of got to keep on moving here. And then the other side of things where this was an impactful event for you, and whether it's at the end of the day or at some point in time that we need to get you some resources. How do you distinguish kind of that fine line there between the two?
Well, if I have to go, for myself, it's training first. Okay. So we train our members to be prepared for the worst incidences that come about. So when you go there, you sort of come out yourself and you perform. But the importance now, which didn't happen as much then, is having those debriefs afterwards to acknowledge, okay, this is what you've gone through, this is what you've seen, you know. I mean, Dan can say it because they're the part like mine that's in life, you know, they had a member who was on probation who ended up losing their life, and how helping the new class people go through it. Those are the different things that are more difficult afterwards. And that's sometimes what we may need to help, because we train for the things to come, but we don't always prepare to deal with the things after it happens. And I think that's the difference in what we're trying to now prepare for that as well.
And I think just to piggyback on what you said, correct me if I'm wrong. So in addition to the training and having the ability to be prepared for certain instances, it's also more accepted that if an individual does happen to develop some symptoms, that the department may be okay with this individual getting help and talking about it, as opposed to maybe seeing that person as different or weak or so forth. Would you agree with that?
That would be ideal. I don't think that we're there yet. And this is conversations we have with each other, trying to, as leaders in our own organizations, to get our organizations to that point. So that is the goal of one of mine, but I don't think many organizations are at that point yet. And maybe Dan, you could talk about that.
No, I agree. We're not there yet, but that is the ultimate goal, right? And I think, you know, in the moment, we rely on our training. We're trying to make things better. We're trying to help people. You know, we're trying to save lives and property. The phrase I like to use is professional detachment, right? So we're doing our thing. We're trying to make things better for people, but it's afterwards, you know, when the intensity level ratchets back down and you're not quite as focused on the task at hand, and now you're into the more reflective stage. That's when you realize that, you know, this particular call or those calls or whatever are traumatic and they're a problem. And if we can get the members within the organization to understand it's okay to verbalize that, and if we can recognize it within each other, and I think it has to happen on a smaller level. It can't come from our administration. It has to happen, you know, in the firehouse with your, you know, your 4-person crew or your 9-person crew. You have to have some people who can recognize these things, who can be open and who can talk about it and get it out there and have those discussions about healthy ways of dealing with it.
Certainly.
Part 2 of this discussion on firefighters and post-traumatic stress injury will continue on the Bay Area Mental Health Hour on YouTube. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel today to receive notifications of all of our new and upcoming episodes, including personal interviews with firefighters. And if you're interested in sponsoring our show, please send an email to me, aliciamayo430@gmail.com. Your support for the Bay Area Mental Health Hour makes it possible for us to produce informative and educational news like this. Thank you. If you're in a crisis and need immediate attention, dial 911 or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Or call Safe Call Now, a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week first responder helpline at 1-206-459-3020. Black woman owned. ClariT Media. Firefighters are first responders to unimaginable life and death emergencies. They train to save lives, but coping with the weight of the noble task of being a firefighter can lead to an internal fire of depression, anxiety, and sometimes suicide. Who will answer the call for the firefighter as they try to find ways to cope with post-traumatic stress injury?
I wanted to just briefly talk about and throw some concepts out there that are very relevant in our discussion here today. So if you are experienced and exposed to a severe or frequent stressor, you could develop potentially post-traumatic stress disorder. We all know what that term is. That is a common outcome. Depression, anxiety, an adjustment disorder. And just to kind of briefly touch upon adjustment disorder is basically just a significant response to an identifiable stressor. So it can be, doesn't have to be within first response, but it can be work is really tough on you, and socially and occupationally, you're not able to really kind of hold together at that time. Or it can be your child or family member is going through something significant, and it's pretty tough for you to endure that as well. So we have kind of likely sort of diagnoses that one can experience, particularly if we're talking about first responders, EMTs, fire, police. Those are likely outcomes if we're talking kind of what you said earlier, kind of a compounded sort of stress, as well as if there's a severe sort of situation, such as the ghost fire situation there. In your experience with all the years you guys have on in fire, what would you say are like the most common ones that you've seen, and in what ways would you say that they've manifested themselves to where maybe you've noticed it in other people, whether it was your colleagues or people under you?
I think there's two particular: child death and senior death. Because many of our members have young children, and at the incident may resemble the incident in their family, or many of us have parents who are either sick or just passed away. And a lot of times you may not notice it, but then when you go on that call and you see it right then, it triggers emotions of your own experiences. And those are probably the most difficult ones I've seen, even for myself or my other crew members' experience, because they had just either gone through that or are currently going through those same situations. And
Sure. Do you guys agree or disagree with that?
I think I agree, and I think the challenge when I was young, the looking at guys that were older, I didn't understand why, with the children, because I was 18 years old. So for me, I was still a kid, basically. I was entrusted with a lot of trust at a young age, but I think the empathy of relating to somebody who has a child who is a parent in the department, I didn't have that emotional intelligence at that age, to have the empathy of, wow, what would that be like, So I think if we can go through that lens of whatever the call is, because all these calls at the end of the day are not good. That's why we're there, to look at it with that the empathetic view of what is it like for that person? Because what might be for Sean is not for me.
Exactly.
What may be for Dan is not for me. And you may go to ghost ship fire and it might not bother you. You may have something 6 months down the road and something comes up and it does that. For me, I had a call where it was a suicide call. Not a lot of first responders go on suicides. We just don't have a ton in America, even though the numbers are high compared to other accidents and other sorts of traumas. It's still one of those calls that not everybody sees in a 30-year career. So here I was in my late 20s, and that call messed me up. it really messed me up. And there wasn't the support system at the time. The culture wasn't there at the time. You know, the things that Sean and Dan both have in place in their departments at the time. Unfortunately, my department, the culture with labor management issues and politics were not of that, where you supported the person going through it. You view the person as weak. So I didn't get the resources that I needed at the time. I had to find a lot. EAP, you know, going through it, wasn't really qualified. The people weren't qualified in trauma. So trying to find a therapist through the system versus the networking that is happening now all the way from DC to the East Bay of who are the therapists that get this, who are the right people who get our people, and understand, as you know, with work comp, to not hang that person up and then get them in a legal, you know, thing and stress them out even more with another stressor that we don't know how to deal with that. We know how to respond to all these other things, but we don't know how to respond to ourselves, nor do we know how to respond to workers' comp and those other things that are even more of a stressor. So I said, for me, it's, you know, it was a cumulative thing, a lot of stuff that built up. You know?
I'd even like to piggyback and jump on what he mentioned a moment ago. And I want to pose a question to the other panel members. I want to ask, if looking back on your career, what would you say is the call or the situation that stands out most?
Too many.
I have too many.
Yeah.
I could start reeling off a list. There's too many. I mean, there's one from the early 1990s where a guy got shot with a shotgun in the chest at point blank range, right in front of the firehouse with our roll-up doors open on a warm summer night, and his 4-year-old son standing there watching the whole thing while we tried to do CPR on this guy and save his life. There's that one. There's the one where the vehicle drove through the fence into the preschool and was crushing a bunch of toddlers. You know, there's so many. You know, there's so many. That's why I think it's a cumulative thing, and you know, depending. I mean, there's ones that I've forgotten. I actually was working in overtime in another part of town a couple of months ago, and we drove past the building, and I hadn't thought about this call in probably 20 years, but just driving past that building just triggered all sorts of things for me, and I couldn't get this particular call out of my head for another couple of months, and I mentioned it in my one-on-one interview. So I think there's a lot, and over the course of your career, it adds up, and I can definitely see, looking back, yes, they triggered depression, they triggered anxiety, it caused problems in terms of relationships, womanizing, all that, and that was all a manifestation of me not dealing with this stuff in a healthy manner.
And I agree. And for myself, it varied from the beginning. In the early 90s, the drug epidemic, in the Bay Area was strong. So seeing young men who resembled me dying on a regular basis and going to their incidences, working on them, had its impact. Then, it started to go into fires, and I had a Christmas Eve fire when a grandmother and her 5 kids all perished in that fire. And we did a really good job extinguishing the fire, but it didn't matter because they were gone before we got there. So what we thought was a good incident turned out to be a tragic one for those who knew the family. So things like that, car accidents, surf rescue type incidences. And over the years, one by one, it didn't matter. But I remember one day we went to what I mentioned about the Christmas Eve, but also before that we had 3 young men in a police chase who wrecked their car who died, another person who had died in a truck accident. I had 2 babies within a 6-month period who had all died. And the stress unit came and said, "We want to talk to you." We're like, "We're fine." Like, "Okay, you want to have some coffee?" We're like, "Sure, have some coffee." Just started talking to us. Unknowingly, what he was doing was making us actually engage. And by the end of the conversation, 2 members of my thing was like, "Wow," and they, one guy broke down because, he had kids. And I looked around and I realized we had seen all this and nobody talked about it on our crew, and nobody wanted to acknowledge it. And we didn't realize how bad it was until we all began to speak about it. And that was like a turning point for me early on. I had like 6 years in my career, but I was like, wow, I did not realize how much it affected me. So, I mean, I think how it is that we just sort of forget about it.
Sure. I want to just briefly talk about resources. And so certainly if we're discussing today and having dialogue around all these incidents and just different issues that can happen in the life of a first responder, what are the resources that are out there? And I want to ask one of you to briefly talk about peer support specialists, because this is kind of a newer sort of concept where you can take someone like myself, who's a trained psychologist, off-site. You got to find me. You got to know kind of who the people are to work with. But a peer support specialist can be someone within your field who knows exactly what it's like to be a firefighter and knows the ins and outs of that, but is identified as someone who can provide some form or fashion of emotional assistance. So I'm curious if someone can kind of talk about how that might be helpful.
Yeah, share your insight.
I think it's incredibly important. For the length of my career, we've had an employee assistance program where there's counseling available, and you can see a counselor confidentially, and no one has to know about it. You call an 800 number, and it's all good. Having used that before, that's hit or miss. You might get a counselor who has a clue of what you do, some more than others, or you might get a counselor who basically sits there and they can't believe what you're telling them, but they're not helping you.
Right. Yes.
And then you might find someone who has experience with first responders, and it makes a difference, and it can make a difference. But I think initially having the peer support program and having firefighters trained to help other firefighters is immensely beneficial. First on the recognition part, right? So I might not even know that I'm struggling or have an issue, but my fellow firefighter who works with me and who has had some level of training, he notices my mood change, or he notices my behavior change, or whatever. That's enough for him to maybe sit down and talk to me at a quiet moment at the firehouse when it's just us and bring something up. And maybe that's enough to get me steered and pointed in the right direction.
Sure.
Speaking the same language, being part of the same culture, I think it's really important. And in my opinion, the more firefighters that we can train with some level of behavioral health training to help, recognize, get started, just to talk, to get things pointed in the right direction, I think has been one of the biggest changes that's happened.
So out of curiosity, in your respective departments, is there a list of providers that you guys can turn to where you know that they fit that qualification, that understanding of what it means to be a firefighter, and not the ones that are so surprised by your shaman out there not being helpful? Is there a list of?
Well, in San Francisco, we're actually taking lead in Oakland. So our International Association of Firefighters has a peer resource program that they teach. We're bringing instructors down this October, and they'll be training 30 members to help our peer support unit in dealing with more of these cases. I think that's the entry level, the base level is help, and for most people, it would be effective.
Sure.
We also have other resources. So the California Professional Firefighters, they're now trying to get more resources that would help firefighters throughout the state.
Mm-hmm.
So they've been with the Assembly and our state Senate trying to find resources that way. And we also have our International Association of Firefighters, who have a center of excellence over in Maryland, which is for the severe cases. So what we're finding out is that the peer resource is just the beginning, which will basically help most people if they're identified early and get on the right path. We all know that it won't help everybody. So when it doesn't help everybody, we need to be able to have the resources on the state level and on federal level to make sure that we save more people, careers, their lives, and their families. So I think it's important, like Dan mentioned, and so we're following their footsteps and getting that basic level in there now, and then hopefully we'll have more support across the board.
I think one thing Sean mentioned that I think is important is, for us especially, it's more labor driven. It's driven by the labor groups. It's driven by the locals. It's driven by the California Professional Firefighters. It's driven by the International Association of Firefighters. It would be great if we could find more buy-in from our administration and from our cities to realize that aspect of treating behavioral health for firefighters is a big avenue, and they should invest in that and help support that and keep that going, because that's just a good investment for them, for their people, to get their firefighters to have a productive 30-year career rather than a smaller career.
What would be the reason why that wouldn't be supported by cities? It would seem like a no-brainer.
Well, bureaucracies grind slowly, and it costs money. For us, we've had the class that Sean's talking about, they're going to do in October. We did it here, and we were able to get maybe a little less than 24 of our people, because our department couldn't support the backfill. So in other words, you couldn't, they wouldn't give you the day off work to go attend the classes. So if you had to get trades to cover that, or they wouldn't backfill it with overtime, so you could be out of your station to go to the classes. That's one just on the ground aspect of the money that it costs. The other thing is it costs money to have these classes come in, to fly these instructors in. It's hard to get the administrations to come through. That's been our experience.
My thought would be that anytime that you're looking at a job and how much time, money, and resources it takes to fill that position, you would think the retention of that individual is going to be very important, because the idea of training someone else to take that position is going to cost even more money, right? And especially from a fire or police perspective, where you got academies and you got all sort of different hoops that you have to jump through. So I'm hoping that comes to fruition at some point. You got a comment you want to make?
No, it's really interesting. I think when we look at mental health in America, right, just in general, and we don't look at it as brain health, as total health, right, with the hormones that are derived through the brain, with the cortisol response, with we have presumptive laws on the books for heart issues, which could easily be traced to not knowing how to manage your stress response, which is up here. So these things long term cost cities so much more money instead of doing the right thing. But we have a fractured leadership across the nation when it comes to first responders, right? We have police officers, sheriffs, firefighters. When you look at veterans, everything is under one umbrella. The VA, DOD has a first electronic healthcare record system, in the US with longitudinal data. They know the health issues, and they know the cost of not treating these things and being aggressive, getting the best practices. So when we look at what veterans have for research and resources and the proactive stance, you look at the VA now, yoga, it's covered, these different things that they're doing. The VA has a lot of great stuff, other than, when news wants to have a hot topic for the day, but overall VAs do great work. So one thing, I put forward, and when Dan and Sean and I met, a few years back, was the need to have healthcare systems begin tracking our first responders in electronic medical records, Epic, the largest one, right? So all this data is just floating around there. So when cities try to justify the cost or this and that, it's very hard to have a transparent conversation on cost benefit. Whereas if we started tracking and say, okay, this firefighter, from day one in the academy until 30 years later has these sort of things and these sort of treatments, these really work, they're effective, I don't think we'd have the issues we have. But since, Oakland does their thing with the city of Oakland, San Francisco does their thing, I was in San Jose, each city has its own data set, and they're not talking. So then we get left with attorneys, a work comp defense who wants to defend everything, and adversarial system, which is the legal system in America, is adversarial. It's not healing.
Sure.
And we're talking about healing. We're talking about healing wounds of helpers and heroes that are going out there that need help. And it's a moral and ethical debate as much as it is a cost debate. And I would love to just see where we lead from our heart. We're like, Dalai Lama, the best religion is compassion. And to say these are people that have given their all, all three of us, I'm no longer in the fire service, but if something happened like the Vegas shooting, those sort of things, we'd be willing to lay our life down to go out there and to go do the right thing for humanity. And now when we need help, why aren't we getting help?
Sure. And if I could just add to that a little bit, you asked why not the resources. Well, part of it is, like I said, it's a cultural change. A lot of our chiefs, they come up in the fire service, so they were brought in under the same culture we were of dealing with it. Then you have a lot of civilians who never experienced it, so they don't really understand what we go through. So you have city administrators, you have mayors, supervisors, council people you don't understand it. So being able to bring the story out is the first part. Next part is to get in the resources to be able to deal with it. And I think if we continue to just work and have these conversations, the reason why labor gets it first, because the members don't go to the admin and say, hey, I have this problem, I need help.
Yeah.
They come to labor organizations and say, hey, I need some help. What's the advice you give us?
Sure.
And so it's forced us as labor leaders to say, okay, I need to learn a little bit more about it. So I had the opportunity to talk to the fire districts of the California conference this June, thanks to Drew. And one of the things I told the leaders, said, as leaders, both on the labor side and the administrative side and as elected officials, we have a responsibility to teach our membership. And part of that is understanding the causes, the things we need to, to support them and, changing the stigma of mental health. It's our responsibility, right? It's our responsibility to educate the public. And if we work better together, as you mentioned before, having that bad labor management relationships is only bad for the members of our departments and for the citizens.
Sure.
We have a stronger one. We can work together as a unified voice and go. But I think the biggest part is changing the culture and then being the advocates that we are either elected or appointed to be.
Yeah. And as what was mentioned earlier, any sort of culture change is certainly like moving a huge ship, and it takes some time to get there. Mm-hmm. Fellas, I think we could kind of continue this conversation indefinitely. We could talk hours and hours. It seems like all of you are very passionate about this topic, and everyone seems invested in trying to turn that ship in the right direction. Just curious, are there any last words or any concept that we didn't cover today that seems important in terms of first response and mental health?
I think one thing is so many first responders, whether police officer, firefighter, and you, Dr. Outlaw, in your capacity, with the laws on the books right now, everybody's been advocating on this for years now to try to get this change in California, where a first responder gets coverage, whereas a veteran goes to the VA, they get care. Mm-hmm. A first responder can be denied care when they come and see, a therapist under work comp. And then we talk about the whole person, right? Financial, the cost of therapy, the cost of being off work if your claim's denied, you have mortgage still going on, you have kids you're trying to feed, soccer programs, trying to, keep your marriage intact. So it's very stressful. What is your advice for first responders to see a successful resolution and approval of their post-traumatic stress claim if there are other factors that the defense tries to dig up? How do you come out all right on the other side?
That is a segment in and of itself, certainly, and I'll just respond briefly to it. First thing is making sure that you get a workers' comp attorney that really is advocating for you, right? So attorneys come in all shapes and sizes, just like psychologists come in all shapes and sizes and so forth. I've worked personally with some workers' comp attorneys that I feel are top notch, and they understand the system. They understand the nuances you alluded to a moment ago. Just if you happen to be stuck in that chasm of the QME, or the qualified medical examiner, determines that your case is less than 51% and therefore it gets denied, and you're in this waiting game, and it gets very complicated. So just briefly, without us taking an entire segment on it, I do think finding the right attorney and finding the right provider as well is important. So in my capacity, I serve many times in workers' compensation as the primary doctor. So I can advocate for someone to get chiropractic work, for them to get their ankle addressed, for them to get mental health services, and anything underneath the sun. And there's a dollar amount that's allocated and approved. As long as your case is approved, that can be used. And I don't want to make it too simplistic, but it can be used for different things. And so as long as you have a provider who understands that, you have an attorney who understands the system, you're going to be better off than you would be elsewhere. And we all started at some point in time. And I can even think back to when I first started doing workers' compensation cases. I thought I knew a lot, but I didn't. And so now I'm a much more seasoned provider, and that can be very helpful. That makes some sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other topics that we didn't cover? Any other points that we didn't cover that you guys feel are important? If we're talking about first responders and mental health, we certainly talked about diagnosis. We certainly talked about resiliency. We certainly talked about just kind of some of the policy issues and the red tape that goes into it that can make things difficult. We talked about stigma. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that seems relevant?
I think the only thing I would want to add, though, is also educating family members, right? So they can be many times the best judge of personality changes or things. So providing them with information that they can actually use as well too. So that means that's again another bigger subject and topic, but I think educating our family members of what we're going through and how they could be of help to us would be important as well.
Sure. Yeah. And just to piggyback on that, I know we're getting close here, but imagine that your spouse, significant other, children, or whoever has a heightened or a greater understanding of the basic diagnoses and the basic symptoms that are associated with being a firefighter, policeman, or EMT. Imagine that they have a little bit more empathy and sympathy and understanding and insight around kind of the common sort of responses to it. Then chances are, I'm not suggesting that's going to eliminate everything, but chances are maybe you reduce the family sort of stuff going on, and they might be more understanding when an individual is shorter in patience or a little bit quicker to snap and understand that this might be work-related as opposed to it being personal to them. So I'm in full agreement that some level of literature and educating family would be a good start too. It's almost like a website. If there's just a website for that or a link on the side of a website that just has family resources, certainly would be a good idea.
That'd be helpful.
Oh, great. Anything else you guys think would be relevant here? Or do we cover it?
I think we did pretty good.
Yes. Thank you for your time again as well.
Sure.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Certainly. Last thing that I'll say just on camera before we end is I think it's important for us all to know about the resources, right? We touched upon many resources and just kind of touched upon one a moment ago. And information is key, making sure that you understand as much about the common disorders and common responses of first responders is an important first step. As I mentioned a moment ago, some level of there being a list of competent therapists that are local, that also are accepting new clients, because as we know, it can be someone who you know of, but the fact of the matter is that they may be completely full and they're not taking on new clients, so that doesn't help. All these things just around, and you talk a lot about it in terms of yoga and alternative sort of forms of treatment. All this is important, and if we don't have our fingertips on kind of what we might do and who we might turn to, we're kind of left to deal with it on our own. So I think resources is kind of yet another subtopic in and of itself that we can really kind of touch upon.
That's a great point, though, and that brings me back to when I was going through therapy. Is fight like your life depends on it, because it does. So if your therapist gives you an assignment and you're off doing your work, it's work. It's work to get better. Do it. Do the work. For guys, brothers and sisters out there that are listening to this, family members, when we're in the fire academy, we study every day. We polish the boots. We do all of these things to get this career, and do the work to go back to the career before it's too late. Do the work while you're going through therapy. If you're transitioning out of the fire service or as a retiree, you might have, I'm a young retiree, even though I've transitioned out, right? But I did the work to create the next success of health. To me, that success, it wasn't the money, it wasn't the career title. It was how do I just feel good in my body again? How do I feel at peace walking down a big crowded neighborhood? Success of it just being at peace with myself. And I did the work, and I said, all three of us, you included with your training, it's, do the work, make sure you don't take a shortcut.
And real quick, because I know time is limited, but the biggest thing for some of our retirees is that transition from being a public servant to retirement. And I think having steps of preparing as well prior to retirement is important too, to let them know that these are some of the things you will experience when you're going from uniform life to civilian life. These are some of the things you are going to experience in the times when you're by yourself. So we can also get more education to members before they retire, and also in retirement if they need it. I think that's helpful as well too. So
Sure.
yeah.
Well, I think we had a very fruitful discussion here today. I really appreciate each of your perspectives, both in terms of your personal stories as well as your professional ones. Like I mentioned before, we can have this conversation. We can go another 2-3 hours. This is something that we can talk about for many, many hours. But I'm glad that we were able to at least normalize the idea of mental health within first responders and the idea of providing some information that might be helpful for others. Of course, we're talking the greater Bay Area here, San Jose, San Francisco, and Oakland, but someone might be watching the show here today in another state or even in another country. And even just the things we're talking about here, it might spark them to seek a resource or get the help that maybe they wouldn't have done elsewhere. So I really appreciate everyone's insights. And thank you guys again.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
If you're in a crisis and need immediate attention, dial 911 or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Or call Safe Call Now, a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week first responder helpline at 1-206-459-3020. Your support of the Bay Area Mental Health Hour makes it possible to produce news like this. Thank you. Black woman owned. ClariT Media. Tune in weekdays to the Bay Area Mental Health Hour on YouTube, Instagram, and on Facebook. You'll find us covering issues surrounding your everyday coping skills and your mental health and wellness. And remember, your mental health matters as much as your physical health. So thank you so much for joining me again, Dr. J.C. on this subject of firefighters and the mental health crisis that they're facing is a very important subject to me because I think that it spreads across communities, across this country, and throughout our world. We all rely on first responders, firefighters in particular, at some time or another in our lives. I mean, sometimes they're responding to the wildfires. Maybe they're responding to a medical emergency. Mass shootings are out of control with gun violence at this point. We all seem to be living in this crisis responsive mode. And it just doesn't feel normal to many of us, let alone those first responders who are there on the front lines when those tragedies and those traumatic and disastrous experiences happen in our communities. And so it was really important for us to get together with those who are able to tell their stories and those who are responding and serving the communities while going through their own internal fires, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah. We, as I mentioned toward the end of our discussion, we could have met for another 2 or 3 hours. There were other relevant and related topics that we just didn't have the time to cover today, but I felt as if the experiences that they gave us today, the personal and professional experiences, are felt and experienced by, as you mentioned, people across the world, not just here in the Bay Area, not just here in California, but across the world. And I'm hoping that individuals can take this information and benefit from it in some way. One topic that we didn't go into as much detail about is just the long-term effects physically or medically of being exposed to stress and not dealing with that stress. That's just something we just did not talk about, but both police, fire, and EMT all experience that. And there's research that shows that when you compare the group of first responders to non-first responders groups, they actually die before the rest of the population. So here they are putting their life on the line for many, many years, and the idea of retirement is before them, and they pass away significantly before everyone else. And so we talked about a good amount of topics that were relevant, and we even didn't have time for some others as well.
Well, I'd like to continue the conversation. So I would ask the audience to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's the Bay Area Mental Health Hour YouTube channel. You can find us there, and you can also find full episodes of our conversations there, as well as shorter clips that you can watch at your convenience. We are also going to include some of those clips and parts of conversations on Instagram and Facebook. Considering limited time on social media, it is limited. But I do appreciate you coming and being a part of this conversation, and future conversations are going to depend on your expert input and insight on coping skills and more solutions around mental health care for not only, the average citizen, but for specific people in our communities like firefighters and police who do a tremendous amount of work on a daily basis. They suit up with courage and commitment and service to others, and quite often go unnoticed or unrecognized. And so I really appreciate this work. We'll continue this particular series on firefighters and first responders in the near future. But for now, let's just let's say that the one thing I love to always say and remind myself as well as the audience is that your mental health is as important as your physical health. So take care of both. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you're in a crisis and need immediate attention, dial 911 or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255 or call Safe Call Now, a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week first responder helpline at 1-206-459-3020. Your support of the Bay Area Mental Health Hour makes it possible to produce news like this. Thank you. Black woman owned ClariT Media.
Over 26 plus years, I am on my 27th. There's been a lot of things that I've experienced. Many of them I've suppressed because it's just easier to go do the job and not remember it. But some of the things that really stuck out to me when I was a new probationary firefighter at Truck 17 and going to shootings over in the Bayview area and seeing young men who looked like myself had a huge impact, because going to high school, I always hear, you're lucky you can make it to the age of 25, not being in jail or dead. Yeah, I'm in the fire service, 23 years of age, going on calls with young men who look like myself who were under the age of 25, and just being thankful that I had the opportunity to have a job that would hopefully get me past that age, which it did. But, those were traumatic experiences that to many people, they couldn't really understand or relate. But that was almost like looking at myself at times in the city that I was born and raised in. So, and then moving forward, as you get older, you go to calls, children dying, incinerations and fires, in cars, drownings I've been to. I mean, it's a lot. And like I said, I really don't try to recall all of them, because it's easier to just go do your job, consider it your job, not really look at it from a more human, standpoint, but more as sort of robotic. Like, I get paid to go to back into this to make them better. And once it's in, we put them aside and we go back to our regular routines. But it is more like an out of body experience. And it has to be in reality, because we're going to incidences where people are running away from the fire or from the shootings or from whatever disaster. And we're taught to stay calm, to think, to be able to suppress our internal instincts of fear to accomplish these goals. So if you are thinking about your own safety and the things around you, you're less effective in the jobs that you have to do. So in many ways, it's important to be able to control that, but it also has a negative impact, because sympathy and empathy, I started to realize, was not there as much. Growing up in San Francisco, they've always been homeless. It's worse now, but there was a lot more empathy in the things I saw because I didn't understand it. But then once in the job and you start to see things all the time, it's harder sometimes to relate to the whys of people's situation, because we don't create them. Our job is to go in there and make things better. So you have to learn to not think about the why, how this happened at the time, but just go in there, treat signs and symptoms, and then move on and make it better. So to the question, it is sometimes difficult to be in the moment at the time. You have to separate it in order to do the job well. But it is added stress and responsibility. I mean, it's a blessing in some ways to be able to promote and to move into a position of leadership. But that said, as a firefighter, our saying is that everyone has a role in safety. So you see anything unsafe, report it. But as a captain, my role is not just on the firehouse scene, but my role is for our members at the station to make sure that things are in place, equipment and things, make sure that our members are healthy and well trained. So not only do I have to worry about what's happening at the incident, running those calls, I also need to worry about the personnel as a whole, the house as a whole, and make sure that we're operating and functioning. So that added stress to the job, is something that I take very seriously. If if I have a member who may be having issues from an incident they went to, it's my job to make sure they get the help they need, to send them to the path to get that type of situation. It may be something from home. It may not always be what's happening there, but in order to be able to do our job, we need to be able to have our minds there. So try to get that person help during their home situations. Sometimes it's with the spouse or the children or parents or whatever it is, financial. But these are all the things that we have to have emotional intelligence if you want to be a good officer in the fire service, to identify the change of behavior within your crew members, and then to be able to try to get them the assistance that they need in order to be able to function and do their job properly. There are a lot of things that need to change. I think the first thing is just a cultural change. I had the ability to be able to work with great firefighters who knew that we had to evolve from just a fire base to get first responders, EMTs, paramedics. We took on other roles like rescue systems. So it was evolution within the fire service itself. Then there's cultural change. So when I first came in, it was a badge of honor to be able to walk around in your rig or in the firehouse with a jacket and helmet that smelled of smoke from coming from a fire. But then as we started seeing more of our members getting cancer, we had to start looking at what it was. So then we had to change the culture and say, you know what, you can no longer walk around with city turnouts. You need to do a gross decon on the scene. You need to go back, you need to shower, you need to get a new clothes, new turnouts. You need to remove yourself from the element sooner than later. But it took a long cultural change to go from one that had that badge of honor of wearing it to understanding the importance for yourself and your family of going on. Also with diets, we went from having big meat and potato meals, a lot of food was said to be your last meal, but we started to understand that diets have a role in healing. So we started bringing more vegetables, smaller portions, doing that stuff. So the next big component for me was mental health portion. And, I read a lot of articles. I had a lot of trauma, which is my class. I had 30 of us coming in 1993. Now we have 3 of my class members who are no longer with us on this earth, one from suicide, another one passed away from kidney organ failures, and another one, she passed away from breast cancer. And kind of the women in the fire service rates breast cancer a lot higher. So that was like, okay, what's going on? I have less than 25 years in 3. I had another classmate who quit. He had a mental health breakdown. Had others who retired early, before taking her career because all the small deposits from each call going on and not having resources to be able to get help from it. And it got to a point where like, you know what, I'd rather retire, or some quit because they were in retirement age, than to continue in this path. But because I came in so young, I didn't have the opportunity to retire. So I had to find other ways of going. So I started seeking help from people to figure out how can I go. And I found out sort of like what they call the hero complex. Because we're always helping people, we feel like we can't seek the help. And by the time that they go on a path, it's usually because they're forced, because the drugs or alcohol has taken control on their personal life, or they have a true breakdown that they just can't go. What I'm trying to do is to find ways for people to identify emotional intelligence. What are your triggers? Once you find those triggers, what things you have in your life that you can help work your way through it? Just like a healthy diet, exercise, but this is also mental health. And to get out of the hero complex, you need to be able to change the stigma around mental health. And to change that stigma, you have to let other people know that just because you're suffering something, that it's not a bad thing if you're able to identify it and do it healthy. So it's going to start off the cultural change. Then it's going to take leaders within our government, in our fire service, and our labor unions to come together and get legislation passed that will support the peace officers. We have to get training in the fire service or in police department that will encourage people to go to these things. So I think it starts off with a cultural change and led by the leaders, in our country and in our departments. If I'm in a position as the president, can help facilitate this cultural change and be able to bring a healthier environment that will save more people and have less suicides of firefighters, police officers, and it could lead back to the work that I've been doing with people from California professional firefighters to other friends of mine like Dan and Drew and Janice Hayes, another classmate of mine who has a tremendous story of her own, where her and her husband were in Las Vegas doing a shooting. And unfortunately, she lost one of her best friends there. But in the process of all that, she did a lot to save lives. Her husband, her best friend's husband, who was a San Francisco police officer. Those type of stories, incidences, if they can not be helped themselves, but let their stories be told to help save someone else, then that's how I would like to be remembered in that way.
If you're in a crisis and need immediate attention, dial 911 or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Or call Safe Call Now, a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week first responder helpline at 1-206-459-3020. Your support of the Bay Area Mental Health Hour makes it possible to produce news like this. Thank you. Thanks for joining me here on ClariT Media. This is Alicia. Glad to be with you tonight. I hope you enjoy these episodes of the Bay Area Mental Health Hour and ClariT Conversations. Now, if you're interested in advertising your business, products, or services, reach out to me at aliciamayo430@gmail.com or call me at 707-430-8355. I will be more than happy to talk with you about your goals for your business, your marketing and social media plans, etc. I do it all. That's what I'm here for. I'm a nonprofit 501c3. That means my rates are affordable if you're interested. So again, thank you for joining me here on ClariT Media for ClariT Conversations and the Bay Area Mental Health Hour. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube. Look for the Bay Area Mental Health Hour or ClariT Media. Thank you. Black woman owned. ClariT Media.